In this episode, anthropology professor Dr. James MacKenzie explores Being Maya, Reflections on Ethnicity, Religion, and Place. The Maya, as classified by scholars at least, are among the most populous indigenous peoples of the Americas, with some 6 million living in and around Guatemala and southern Mexico, not to mention hundreds of thousands who have migrated to the United States in recent years. In this talk, Dr. MacKenzie reflects upon what he has learned since the mid-1990s from contemporary indigenous Guatemalans, many of whom now identify in some way as Maya.
For those of you who saw the opening card, you're probably wondering, who is this man? I just woke up from a long sleep. Where am I? What is happening? All right, well, to begin, many thanks, first of all, to the organizers of this event, Catherine Reeder in particular, and the hardworking staff of the Dean's Office. It is a real honor to be able to be asked to present for you today, and also a distinct challenge following up on the heels of Dr. Trevor Harrison. Well, Dr. Harrison, if you managed to attend that talk, it was very popular about populist politics. Well, he's the author of many books. I ask you this: do any of his books weigh precisely 666 grams, as does my, that's one thing weight, does my single book? While some academics are warmed by things like citations from their peers, the mark of the beast carries much more weight in the circles I choose to impress. So, anyway, what I'm going to talk about today in plain speech, which means I have nowhere to hide, are a few things that I've come to learn about what the word Maya means for the people who potentially, at least, may use this term to refer to themselves, and how it compares to the sorts of things that scholars and others say about the Maya. Those others are many, from tourists to New Agers to sundry creators of popular culture. The Maya even made it into the new Wonder Woman movie. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see Wonder Woman 1984, but the Maya make an entrance. So I figure the easiest way into this topic is with a little autobiography, so you can get a sense of how these things began to interest and even puzzle me, really. But first, a tiny bit of background on some terms and contexts. And an admission, an important one, because I know you're going to have lots of questions, and so trying to figure out what I'm capable of answering is probably important. So to begin with the latter, this is an admission. I'm an anthropologist who studies the Maya of Mesoamerica. There's a map of Mesoamerica here, with actually a lot of the archaeological sites. But I have to admit I'm woefully behind on the massive and growing literature concerning pre-Hispanic, especially classic and earlier Maya archaeology. So I have gone to places like this. This is me years ago visiting Tikal. You can't really see, but I have a very puzzled expression on my face there, which probably will continue if you ask specific probing questions on the nature of the archaeological record. I'm often asked the question, where did the Maya go? And the only answer I can really give is nowhere. Maybe they left the jungles or they went somewhere else. There's many million of them today. They didn't disappear, right? So if you ever any questions that relate to the archaeological record, I might not be as much use to you. But there are archaeologists I could probably direct you to. Now a little bit of background before I get into some of my, biography and how I got to be interested in these things. As far as the term Maya, where did that word come from? It's worth noting that it was not originally an ethnic term to refer to a group of people, and it only appeared in colonial language, in colonial indigenous language sources infrequently, generally to refer to a particular language, the Yucatec language, or as a reference to an important post-classic center called Mayapan in the Yucatan Peninsula, and to the diaspora that was created when that site was abandoned. It came to be used more generally by the Spanish-speaking elites in that part of Mexico at the time to refer to a regional subvariety of the general ethnic category that was in use at the time, Indio or Indian, to refer to the native peoples of the area. So specifically in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this followed the so-called caste war in the 19th century. Here's a painting that's demonstrating some of the horrors of this particular war. Now, and this was an interesting war. It was one where the non-indigenous elite quickly and erroneously framed this whole thing as a race war. So the Maya became, in the eyes of this elite, a term to refer to a collective enemy. However, the indigenous people themselves in this period, and in many contexts of the present, did not see themselves as a united collective in ethnic terms. Still, since this origin, the term Maya came to be used as well, more generally in academic and national circles to refer to a culture, regardless of the fact that the indigenous people so designated did not start using this term themselves until much more recently, if at all. So as far as identity and ethnic labels are concerned, terms like in Spanish, indígena, which means indigenous, or natural, which can mean something like native, have been much more common. Though being indigenous hasn't typically meant, until fairly recently, that you would also organize your activities and politics together with others who may not even speak the same indigenous language, or Maya language, say, as you. Rather, historically and in many cases at present, indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica have been much more likely to identify with and organize their politics through the communities in which they live, which is one of the reasons why anthropologists like me have tended to hang out in these places for long periods. But things are changing, and they've changed over the time since I've got to know this part of the world. And Maya basically ain't what it used to be. Okay, so now for a little potted biography to illustrate this. So I first traveled to Guatemala in 1994, as Matt mentioned, with the goal of learning Spanish in anticipation of future graduate work in anthropology. I just finished my undergrad degree at the University of Alberta. And my first friends in that country were my teachers at a small cooperative language school called Centro Maya de Idiomas. So here we have Anna, who was my very first Spanish teacher. She's wearing the indigenous dress, which is typical of the city of Quetzaltenango for the Quiche. And later, I studied the Quiche language with, there's Flori, you can see there, she's probably very frustrated with me and my inability to produce the sound, which is an important one. I did master it, she was very happy with me. And I'm looking quite tired and confused, which is a common thing. Now, this school was founded a year earlier, in 1993, by 10 indigenous women and men, a number of whom spoke, in addition to Spanish, Mam, Anopal, Quiche, and Ekchi, which are 4 of the 30 or so Mayan languages spoken in Mesoamerica. 21 of these are spoken in Guatemala. And a little perspective there, I mean, Guatemala is the size of the island of Newfoundland. So if you could imagine that much linguistic diversity within, that kind of space, it's really something. Now anyway, language study took up our mornings with conferences, films, and day trips planned for the afternoons. So on one of these day trips, it turned out it was rather fateful for me, as it ended up setting the course for my master's research. And it's figured into my subsequent work in a range of ways. So on a Thursday afternoon, we boarded a bus to the town of Zunil, which is about a half an hour from the city of Quetzaltenango. The plan was to visit the colonial church, to browse the wares at the weaving cooperative, and to check out the town's main attraction, the shrine to San Simón. Now, so there's a picture of San Simón. I'm not sure how well this shows up. He probably looks interesting to you. He's wearing sunglasses, a cowboy hat. He's seated, and he has a two-piece suit. He's wearing a bright orange shirt with a bright orange tie. Now, I had already heard about this folk saint from my guidebooks, which offered descriptions like the following, which I'll quote from the Lonely Planet Guide to Guatemala, which is under the glib title, "That's One Smokin' God." So here's what they had to say. The Spanish called him San Simón. The Ladinos, more on that term later, named him Mashimon. The Maya know him as Rilach Mam. By any name, he is a deity revered throughout the Guatemalan highlands, assumed to be a combination of Maya gods, Pedro de Alvarado, who's the conquistador of Guatemala, and the biblical Judas Iscariot. San Simón is an effigy to which Guatemalans of every stripe go to make offerings and ask for blessings. A visit will be memorable no matter where you encounter him. For a small fee, photography is usually permitted, and offerings of cigarettes, liquor, or candles are always appreciated. Now, I must have sensed the beginnings of an anthropological puzzle here, but at the time, and to this day, my memories of visits to San Simón in Zunil, this town here, and elsewhere in the country, are more sensorial than strictly intellectual. The air in these shrines is close and waxy from candle smoke, heavily scented with perfumed water and a sharp tang of cheap liquor and cigarettes, much like a dean's office. So thank you for laughing at that one. The image in Zunil holds a court seated in a chair, which is tipped back by his attendants to receive offerings of booze, which is reportedly collected and resold. Or he slowly smokes a cigarette attached to an elegant-looking holder. There's a constant murmur of prayer in different languages, with on-site specialists for hire ready to provide a limpamiento, which is a kind of cleansing. This is actually my wife, Jana, getting a limpamiento. A specialist is using bundles of herbs dipped in liquor and lightly struck around the supplicant's body. And they do this with an efficiency and a business-like attitude that always reminded me of the confident work of the shoeshine kids that I got to know through the years. Now, San Simón himself tends to be dressed in a blazer and dress pants with a tie, a cowboy hat, and ubiquitous sunglasses that we've seen here. Though I've seen him sporting a military outfit, as we see here. This is in the town of San Andrés, which you'll hear more about. And I've also seen him in doctor's scrubs. Now, while people visiting these shrines may indeed revere this image, as the tour guide tells us, they certainly don't treat him in the way that official saints, the ones behind the glass in local churches, for example, are treated. So I've seen San Simón hugged, shaken, danced with, and even lightly punched as visitors make the sorts of requests to him that aren't considered appropriate for more straight-laced saints. This is a little sped up, but that's actually me and Jana doing an excellent traditional dance with a couple of young people, and there's my friend Cristobal dancing with the image of San Simón on there's a half kind of birthday for him, so he put on this party. Now, so what to make of this? And what does an image like San Simón have to do with the Maya, or with the people who were assigned other ethnic labels in Guatemala? As a start, he doesn't really look stereotypically indigenous. Indeed, his typical dress is that which indigenous people themselves associate with the Ladino, which has become a general catch-all ethnic category in Guatemala that refers to the socially, politically, and economically dominant population who broadly identify with the national Spanish language, culture, and ancestry, whatever their own ancestry might be. Now, in addition to language, one of the most common markers of indigenous or Maya identity in Guatemala is the use of a distinct form of dress, especially by women, as you saw in some of those earlier pictures, which tends to be called traje in Spanish, as opposed to vestido, also Spanish, which refers to Western-style clothing. San Simón is rarely seen in traje, and his light skin also stereotypes him racially as a Ladino. More tellingly, perhaps, my friends and neighbors in the town of San Andrés, where I conducted my doctoral fieldwork, as Matt mentioned, in the early 2000s, and which has been my principal field site since, they routinely refer to the image as mus, which is how you say, in a playful and somewhat derogatory way, Ladino in Quiche. Now, for the record, mus was also one of the many nicknames that I accrued, despite my protests that I was technically more of a gringo than a Ladino. When I'd go off to visit the San Simón shrine in Chicul, my friends would often tease me with, "Off to visit your dad, are you, Jamie?" They also called me Bin Laden, as I was suspiciously out of the country during 9/11. Anyway, and a number of you, if you have questions, I could give you a number of other nicknames that they gave me. Now, we seem to have come some distance from the guidebook definition of this deity, which neatly assigns his various names to discrete ethnic groups. San Simón for the Spanish, whoever those are these days, Mashimon for the Ladinos, and Rilachmam, which translates as venerable grandfather for the Maya. Now, the indigenous Guatemalans I've come to know are less united when it comes to assigning an ethnic category to this saint, who, truth be told, has a somewhat ambiguous reputation. It is often associated with witchcraft, or at the very least, a somewhat dubious moral standards, what with all that drinking and smoking, like a dean. So I can keep using that joke? That's okay. As long as the laughs keep coming, anyway. Now, I've tried to sort out some of this in my research, but truth be told, San Simón is an inherently unstable sort of figure. I've come to appreciate that indigenous people's opinions on this deity have a lot to do with how they categorize themselves vis-a-vis others, who can be their own neighbors, or Ladinos, or gringos like me, or other indigenous people more broadly at regional or even national or international levels. So, for example, in Chicul, the late Don Mario, there's Don Mario, a good friend of mine, he was the main caretaker of the image for many years, And he'd always stressed to me that Simón, which is the term they use to refer to San Simón in Shekul, is a local first and foremost. While he's Ladino in appearance, he's as old as the town itself. Mario placed him together with another ancient, light-skinned, holy foreigner, the image of the town's patron, Saint Andrew. So this is the image. He's actually really tiny. He's covered in little gold coins and stuff. I could tell you a lot about this particular image, a miraculous image. And he's thought to have been present at the very founding of the community, and he's strongly associated with its ancestors, and nominally at least, the local version of Catholicism and its saint cult. So while parish priests through the years have generally rejected San Simón as about as far from Catholic as you can get, Don Mario would make a point of organizing an extra official procession through the streets every October 28th, featuring an image of St. Jude. So there's Don Mario, there's the image of St. Jude, who he called San Simón's brother and considered him kind of a stand-in for San Simón. And he also shares that day with the October 28th in the official Catholic calendar of saints with the official Saint Simon. So those two are kind of linked according to the Catholic calendar. Now this procession would attract a modest crowd of locals, as well as a group of Honduran pilgrims who annually made the trip. You can see one woman over here wearing a red bandana. They always kind of market themselves as these pilgrims. And for years, they always come and participate in this particular procession and celebration of Simón. Now, Mario also stressed to me that of all the San Simón images in the country, and there are many, the one in Shekul was the oldest, the most authentic, and basically in charge of all the others. He gave him the title of good governor of all the other lesser San Simóns. So for Don Mario, Simón occupied an important center of spiritual powers, second in Guatemala only to the popular Catholic pilgrimage site of the Black Christ of Esquipulas. Now these powers are reflected as well in 4 titles in addition to good governor that Don Mario provided Simón. He called them the university professor, the lawyer and advocate, the doctor who cures all illnesses, and the colonel/chief of migrations to the United States. So kind of more recent entry to reflect local need as migration to the United States became more and more popular through the late 80s and into the 90s. Now, while Don Mario didn't reject a Maya ethnic label for himself, as opposed to the more general term indigenous, his primary loyalties were consistently directed towards Shekul itself, and his efforts in defining and promoting San Simón came down to connecting the saint, as far as he could anyway, to the town's founding mythology and its important Catholic symbols. Now, others in the town were less sure about this deity and how to categorize him. Sure, all agreed that he's in some respects local, even if that just meant that the image had been associated in some way with the town's roster of saints for as long as anyone could remember. And it seems that San Simón or Simón had a more public role in the past, especially during Holy Week celebrations, where I've been informed that the image was hanged and burned in the church patio every Holy Thursday, representing both the biblical Judas and the old God of an annually dying world, making way for the young God, Jesus Christo, who brings forth agricultural fertility and abundance. But no one was as strong anyway as Mario in their insistence that Simón was the most important San Simón image in the country. There are, of course, many others which are much more famous, including the image from Zunil and the one where you saw Jana getting her limpiamiento. That actually has its own church, essentially. So now, but many other Shekulenses, perhaps having paid attention to decades of critical homilies from priests, were less certain as well that the tradition was actually Catholic at root. Even among those who were otherwise sympathetic to what people call costumbre, which is what anthropologists often classify as a kind of traditional or folk Catholic religion, which is strongly influenced by a form of shamanism. Even for these people, the place of Simón was more controversial. This was especially the case among those local shamans, who were called Atlixap in Quiché, who had begun to consider themselves perhaps more Maya than Catholic in religious terms. Now, since the early 1990s especially, as indigenous Guatemalans, together with other civil society actors, began working to help shape the peace process and the Accords, which brought an end to over 3 decades of genocidal civil war in 1996, it's become very popular and common to promote a Maya ethnic identity as the common foundation for the country's various indigenous peoples. This has meant establishing some contents for that identity in formal terms, including the official recognition and support for Maya languages, things like bilingual education as well, and protection, especially for women, from discrimination based on their dress. And also the definition of a unique religious identity, often called espiritualidad Maya or Maya spirituality, which is considered to be separate from any kind of association with Catholicism, and which has its own authorities. And these authorities are principally those formerly community-based shamans who now generally prefer the term guía espiritual in Spanish, or spiritual guide, or more commonly you hear sacerdote Maya, or Maya priest, if they aren't using the term like aquí, a term from an indigenous language like Quiche. Now, since the 1990s, a number of national level associations promoting Maya spirituality have been formed, generally based in urban settings like Guatemala City, with their leadership often claiming broad representation for Akihap throughout the entire country. Though to date, there are a few mechanisms to substantiate or formalize claims to representation in this way. Now in Shekul, a good number of local shamans, and by the way, if you do have questions, I'm not going to go into much detail on the specific nature of shamanism or other religious options I'm talking about, but I'd be happy to go into more detail later. Here we have a group of local shamans who did organize in Shekul. They called themselves the Grupo Washkit Bats Pakotzich, and they're at actually Pakotzich, which is a shrine on the edge of the mountain kind of overlooking Shekul. And it's actually the site where the miraculous image of St. Andrew, the Catholic patron saint, was discovered. And so here they are actually performing a group ceremony, just finishing it, involving fire and stuff for various purposes. Anyway, I can get into that if you have more questions. Now, so they have been supportive of this national level process of kind of promoting Maya spirituality. It's seen their practice gain legitimacy, though most of them haven't given up on a Catholic identity. So locally, shamans have long been subject to suspicion. Witchcraft can often be associated with their practice, as shamans themselves admit. They talk about, other folks perhaps being witches. Now, Orthodox Christians of either Catholic or Pentecostal stripes are much blunter in their criticism. They'll characterize shamanism as pagan or even actively satanic. So in this context, many local self-identifying Maya priests that I knew, or shamans, were less than willing to consider the admittedly controversial Simón as an authentic Maya deity. So for example, my barber, Marcelino, who was also a shaman, he was clear on this. We'd always talk and cut my hair, and we got in lots of wonderful conversations. And I asked him about this. He was very clear. He said Simón is an image that was imposed by the Spanish on the Maya to trick them into performing witchcraft. He argued that his ancestors, the ancient Maya, did not know about such abominations. So any self-respecting Maya priest these days has to reject this stuff in the favor of a pure and what he considered a benevolent spiritual practice. Now, when I asked him how he knew that Simón was Spanish or Ladino and not indigenous or Maya, he answered simply, just look at him. He's dressed like a politician. Oh, well, I'm just illustrating there. That's cowboy hats, Now, when you move beyond Shekul, however, and talk to those that are involved in the Maya spirituality movement, a more favorable view of San Simón emerges, which has become something of an orthodoxy I've found over the decades since I first started learning about these things. The most common story in this context has San Simón as actually Lahma, venerable grandfather, as we heard earlier. He's described as a tireless defender of the Maya at the time of conquest, who was caught and bound in ropes by the Spanish. But he managed to escape and he disappeared into the waters of the beautiful Lake Tatitlán. But then he returned in spiritual form through the various San Simón images throughout the country. So now he's disguised as a Ladino to confuse the oppressor. And he's truly Mam Simón, the bound grandfather. When they call him Mam Simón, that references both this origin story that he was tied up and then he escaped, and also the way that these images tend to be constructed. Most San Simón images, or many of them anyway, are actually sacred bundles. There'll be a core of straw and other materials which are tied together with ropes, and then a mask that's used for the face. Now, for many contemporary leaders of the Maya spirituality movement, an identity for this image along these lines is now canonical, and they're quick to correct what they consider to be misinterpretations when, for example, The yearly news cycle will report on festivities concerning the deity, either during Holy Week, where San Simón or Mashimon or one of these comparable images will be celebrated, or on October 28th, the kind of official day for San Simón. They'll often be reportage on this, and people will say things like it's actually Judas or it's actually this or that. And these authorities are very clear that no, this is Rilachmam, and this is who this particular thing is. Now, so to sum up, determining the origins and especially any ethnic associations this deity might have, I hope it's clear, it really depends on the nature of the key social relationships and the networks of people that you talk to. So in a town like Shekul, for some, for Mario especially, Shimon is a local and he's Catholic, with broader ethnic distinctions subsumed in the same way they are actually by those who consider St. Andrew to be also both a non-indigenous foreigner and also the paragon of local identity and indigenous identity and morality. Now for others in that town, like Marcelino, who consider themselves ethnically Maya and see this reflected in their shamanic practice, San Simón is a malevolent colonial imposition. Now this reflects both their support of broader Maya ethnic politics and also their local sensitivity to the ambiguous reputation of this deity. Shamans like Marcelino are much more likely to find themselves defending their practice against other locals, especially hypercritical indigenous Pentecostals or Catholics, to whom they may then actually quote, I've seen this, they'll quote sections of the peace accord. When people say, oh, you're practicing witchcraft, they say, we're not doing witchcraft. They'll quote the peace accords, which officially recognize the legitimacy and the benevolent character of Maya spirituality. Now, with his ambiguous reputation, San Simón is simply not a useful ally in that particular local battle. Now, at the national level, for leaders of the Maya spirituality movement, whose main networks are centered around international NGOs, government bureaucracies, activists, politicians, etc., the deity carries the potential to represent a unified and original Maya spirituality that goes beyond these specific communities and all the various sorts of conflicts that you might find there. So local indigenous communities, while potentially an ethnic grassroots for Maya activists, are problematic for these leaders as the public religiosity in these places tends to be defined by centuries-long attachments to Catholic patron saints. So San Simón's rejection by the Catholic Church represents an opportunity for the national level Maya priests. The deity has to be more thoroughly Mayanized, called Rilachmam, which is a name. It's a very common name for it, so it's very legitimate that they do this in order to be effectively claimed. Now, what struck me as I've tried to follow all these threads was the extent to which an ethnic Maya identity in Guatemala has increasingly become defined in terms of religious belief and practice, which for many in recent years has become at least as important as speaking a Maya language, or even more important than speaking a Maya language or wearing indigenous costume. Now I'll share a couple more vignettes away from San Simón here to show how this works out. So if Zunil is famous to tourists for its San Simón image, Shekul is famous for its Maya church. This was another place I was brought to by my language teachers in Quetzaltenango during our afternoon field trips. Though there wasn't much to do there tourism-wise, especially in the early 90s. The folks in Shekul really hadn't figured out how to exploit gringos and tourists. I actually was called upon to help them figure that one out. They just weren't good at begging, and going, hey, give me money, give me stuff. They have much more other really popular tourist places. Little kids and stuff will come up and know exactly what to do with tourists. Anyway, so this is another place I was brought. There wasn't much to do besides take pictures, take in the views, and especially take pictures of this colorful church. Now, it wasn't until I started doing ethnographic research in the community that I learned that the town actually also has a San Simón image. Despite all of Mario's attempts to promote it, it wasn't in the guidebooks. But what about this church? Pictures of this structure abound in tourist literature throughout Guatemala and in guidebooks. So the 2010 edition of The Lonely Planet for Guatemala, for example, simply encourages visitors to, quote, feast your eyes and soul on that wild church, which, as you see, is featured on the cover of that volume. And it's described as, quote, the most bizarre, stunning church imaginable. Technicolored saints, angels, flowers, and climbing vines fight for space with whimsical tigers and frolicking monkeys on the shocking yellow facade. The red, blue, and yellow cones on the bell tower are straight from the circuit's big top. Now, other guides, like photos, for example, attempt an explanation. Like, well, what is this? Why is it these colors? And they say, that the images on they compare the images on the facade, for example, with the animal motifs that adorn the blouses, which are called chicot. Basically, chicot is like a critter. The critter and a pot is a huipil, which is the Spanish name for the indigenous blouses that women wear. So they'll say, oh, look, there's animals here and there's animals on the church. So that must be the connection here. Or they'll simply draw your attention to those aspects of the structure that they call Maya. Now, for his part, the Ladino Guatemalan anthropologist and writer Carlos René Garcia Escobar, he published a little story about the church, suggesting that local shamans considered the colorful facade, these colors and stuff, to have been produced in the earliest times, basically in mythological time, as a place where these shamans, and he calls them brujos, which is basically sorcerers or witches, could record their ancient history so that they wouldn't be forgotten, while St. Andrew, this spiritual antagonist, took up residence within the church. So it's sort of like a religious M&M or a Smartie of a church. It's crunchy and colorful and Maya on the outside and Catholic and chocolate on the inside, I guess. Now, to be honest, I'm really not sure what Garcia Escobar, where he came up with this story. It really does seem to be cut from whole cloth. No one I've ever met in Shekul has told me anything remotely similar, especially as concerns the construction of the church itself. There's a widely shared myth about that, but it doesn't include brujos or shamans or whatever, or ancestral Shekulenses at all. St. Andrew doesn't even feature into the tale. He has his own origin story, and people tended to be a little unclear as to which came first, the saint or the church. Anyway, according to Shekulenses, the church was the work of a trickster deity and a giant who's called Yeguachi. Other places they call him Yeguachi. He's associated with the earth, and he's a shaper of the landscape. And he built it in a single night in a failed attempt to win the hand of the daughter named Maria of the celestial guard with whom he was arguing. Now, as far as the colorful facade is concerned, any Shekulense knows, especially those tenacious brujos, who are most certainly not forgotten, it was not painted in the earliest times, unless those times be the early 1980s. As I eventually discovered, the painting of the facade in colors that were explicitly chosen for their Maya significance was part of a project of cultural and religious evangelization directed at that time by Shekul's first resident Catholic parish priest, the late Padre Tomas Garcia. Now, I've written a lot about this project, and I won't go into much detail here, but suffice to say that Padre Tomas, himself a Quiche Maya, one of the first indigenous men to be ordained a Catholic priest in Guatemala, was very concerned with instilling a local form of Catholicism that respected and incorporated what he considered to be the original indigenous spirituality of the Maya. This was very rare. This did not happen at the time in the mid-70s to the 80s. Priests were often very active in certain ways, often with regard to human rights and things. But as far as evangelizing and talking about religion and culture and stuff like that, they were very strict in separating what they considered to be basically witchcraft from Catholic orthodoxy. So this was a rare thing. Now, during his tenure in Shekul from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, he did this project primarily through language and music. He wrote a lot of masses in Quiche with hymns performed by a marimba choir that he trained. And that's me. I got to play bass with the Coro San Andres. It was one of the most wonderful experiences I had. They're fantastic. Anyway, and the marimba, now despite its putative or its arguable, its African origins, is widely considered to be an indigenous instrument in Guatemala. Now, he also sought a rapprochement with shamans and other traditional religious leaders who had generally been vilified by Orthodox Christians of whatever confession, Catholic or say Pentecostal. On a number of occasions, he actually managed to celebrate masses at mountainside altars, preceded by fire ceremonies that were conducted by Atihap. So there's a picture of him doing that. I think this is Chokush, I believe is the name of this particular altar. I'd have to check. Now, while most locals were very supportive of his rather novel approach to evangelization, certainly the shamans were very surprised to see a priest saying, "Hey, you guys are okay." And this is what this project has since been called inculturation by theologians. When I talked to Padre Tomas, he's like, I just thought it was a good thing to do. Vatican II had kind of opened a number of possibilities, but they didn't have a name for this sort of thing. He considered it a local and an important one, and he actually did engage in much broader discussions about this as far as he could. Now, and this style of evangelization has enjoyed varying levels of support in Catholic circles. It really depends upon the positions of the bishops and popes on matters cultural. Currently, Pope Francis is actually pretty big into this. He seems to be talking a lot about this. Benedict, there we are, did not. He called this syncretism, and this was sullying the purity of the Catholic faith. And so there is some controversy here. Now, but as far as locals are concerned, a number did accept, others would reject it. Indeed, one Pentecostal church, which was called Nueva Jerusalem, was founded by a former Catholic leader who wanted nothing to do with Padre Tomas once the latter started associating with the witches. Now, when I asked Padre Tomas about the church and how it came to be painted the way it is, he noted that the colors were specifically chosen for their significance in Maya cosmology. So yellow, the dominant color, while it's generally associated with the south in directional symbolism, was chosen for its symbolic connection to growth and fecundity. The project was undertaken with the support of a prominent local businessman who was also the head of the religious society in charge of the town's patron saint, St. Andrew. Padre Tomas would often admit to me his surprise at the subsequent fame of this project, despite the fact that no one seems to recognize that it's Catholic, or that it has its Catholic, albeit Maya-friendly roots. Indeed, some feel that the church should be considered Maya full stop. I recall an interesting encounter in March of 2002 with an acquaintance, Toribio, who was born and raised in Shekul, but he'd long lived in Quetzaltenango, where he directed a Maya cultural advocacy center and a small publishing house there. I was visiting my friend Ramiro in his office where he worked for the local branch of the National Literacy Program when Toribio stopped by. He told us that he was working on a children's edition of the Pot Wu. This is an important text that was written in the early 1500s in Quiche, using Latin characters, and it presents the stories of creation and cosmology, as well as the history of the Quiche state and its lineages prior to the Spanish invasion. It's broadly referred to as the Maya Bible in Guatemala. What I have here is actually just a picture of the first page of the only surviving copy we have, which is a copy that was made by a priest, Francisco Jimenez, in the 1700s. And he's got the Quiche side on one side and then a Spanish translation on the other side. Now, Padre Tomas, indeed, he often made use of the Pot Wu in his own cultural evangelization. Now, while Toribio came, he was out looking for assistance from Ramiro for another matter related to his studies. He took the opportunity to enlist my help to design the cover for this version of the child's version of the Pot Wu, as he wanted to feature appropriate Maya images from his own hometown. To that end, I was asked to take a picture of the top of the church, which features two jaguars pawing at a pillar. But I was instructed to use my rudimentary Photoshop skills to erase the Christian cross that sits atop of that. So I did that here. You can kind of see it. I'm just trying to wipe that out. And as he said, basically, get rid of that nonsense. We don't need a cross there. That opened a rather kind of one-sided conversation where he attempted to engage Ramiro and myself in a critique of the many, especially elderly Sheculenses, who didn't seem to know that they're Maya. Why do they go off to the mountain and pray to Maya deities like Heart of Sky and Heart of Earth, and then they make the sign of the cross and they address Jesus and all the saints and recite the Our Father? They're clearly confused. Now, he seemed hopeful that the younger generations would be more discerning in these matters. Now, Ramiro was polite, and he laughed along here and there. After all, before Toribio had arrived, the two of us had been talking about the nature and virtues of ancient Maya religion, whatever we thought we understood about that. Now, once Toribio took his leave, however, Ramiro turned to me and he proceeded to dissect our recent guest's family and background, to emphasize that he's only recently Maya, now that it's fashionable. Apparently, he used to be against all that stuff. Now, as it is, Ramiro was one of the directors of the Coro San Andres, the choir that Padre Tomas had founded, and he was very active in the Catholic Church, though he was also proud to be Maya. Indeed, his ethnic pride was largely expressed through his Catholicism, which he contrasted with other versions of that faith, like the Charismatic Renewal, which is a Pentecostal version of Catholicism, essentially, which rejected the project of Padre Tomas. So, if with San Simón we have a tradition that's both local and then broadly Guatemalan, we see it in a range of different communities, which is difficult for some community-level indigenous people to consider fully Maya, this local church in Shekul is at least as complex when it comes to associating it with ethnic labels. On the one hand, it highlights the way being Maya for people like Ramiro whose primary social networks and loyalties revolve around their community. It's much easier if this can also mean being Catholic. But on the other hand, the church has become a much more than a local marker for a particular ethnic religious identity. It's arguably a national symbol exploited by tourist literature and the Guatemalan government to highlight the colorful heritage of the Maya people. In that context, its rather obvious Catholic provenance, it is a church after all, what is not nearly so important as its Mayanness. Now, the irony, of course, is the church never would have become Maya at all if it wasn't for the efforts of an indigenous Catholic priest in his novel form of evangelization. Now, it's remarkable how quickly that specific history of the church has faded, and we can hear these stories about how it was painted in the ancient times, and that's no one knows, But that said, Maya spirituality does need actual physical locations and places for its expression and its definition. And while Catholic churches aren't always the ideal, Maya, like Toribio, are perhaps entitled to stake a claim where they can. More commonly, however, it's archaeological sites where pre-Hispanic Maya societies are defined, contested, and converted into national patrimony that contemporary Maya seek to redefine as sacred ethnic spaces. So I turn to my final vignette, which are some reflections on how debates and claims about ethnicity and religion were worked out at the national and international level during events that took place to commemorate the so-called end of the Maya long count calendar in December of 2012. I published an article on this in 2015 and it deals with some of this, and I'll draw on a little bit of that here. So the fated date of December 21st, 2012 produced terabytes of internet flotsam generated by people from a wide range of backgrounds and perspectives. But it's generally divisible into those who are for it and those who are against it. How clever I can be, right? That's heavy duty analysis. Now, the way the event was covered in mainstream Western media sources, from blogs to global news agencies, was rather consistent. It basically highlighted this tension. So there'd be, stories like this. Here's a couple of headlines. Maya calendar predicts doomsday in 2012, or not. Does the Mayan calendar really predict the end of time? A flurry of reassurances. Then over here, there'd be snarky ones as well, like this one. December 21st, 2012 doomsday. Mayan apocalypse prophecy has come from a new age magic mushroom trick. Anyway, so these sorts of stories, they basically aim, maybe some might aim for an even tone, third person descriptive narrative with headlines such as countdown for the end of the Maya calendar cycle, and Mexico's Maya Armageddon is a boon for tourism. They juxtapose sound bites from New Age believers. For example, Michael DiMartino, who's an American preparing for the event in Chichen Itza in Mexico, for whom, as he said, the date would involve, quote, a distilling down of various perspectives into a unified intention for positive transformation, evolution, and co-creation of a new way of being. And then they have academics like Stephen Houston, who dismiss the date as a, quote, dull mathematical declaration. Now, many of these sources also draw on the perspective of individuals who are designated as indigenous leaders, such as Alvaro Pope, who's a well-known activist in Guatemala, who noted in the press, quote, in Maya culture, scholars were never prophets. That's where there shouldn't be interpretations based on supposed prophecies that don't exist. Or it might be contemporary descendants of the Maya, like Jose May, a tourism official in Merida, Mexico, who opined, quote, if people who believe in this joke want to come, let them. Nobody here believes that. Those people were sold an idea. Now, while arguably most coverage of the event in the mainstream press was content to leave it at that, a number of wire stories, blogs, and reporting went into more detail on the responses of contemporary indigenous people in the region, picking up especially upon the efforts of a Guatemalan organization of professional Maya religious authorities called Oshlahu Achpop. Felipe Gomez, the leader of this group, protested the commercialization of the Maya calendar, and especially the role of the Guatemalan government, the tourism industry, and business in general, for usurping what he nonetheless considered to be an important event for contemporary Maya. In their coverage, the Huffington Post quoted Gomez as, quote, speaking out against deceit, lies, and twisting of the truth, and turning us into folklore for profit. They are not telling the truth about the time cycles. Now, this source goes on to align his critique with the standard line from academics, quoting Professor David Stewart of the University of Texas at Austin, who suggested, quote, the Maya never said anything about the end of the world or anything about a great change in the universe on that date. Now, Felipe Gomez, however, did stress that the date would indeed witness, quote, big changes on the personal, family, and community level, so that there is harmony and balance between mankind and nature. And his views were echoed, more or less, by the Nobel laureate Rigoberta Menchú, who's Guatemala's most well-known Maya activist, who suggested, quote, that The authentic celebration of the Mayas, that will not be seen by everyone. That is part of the private life of the Mayas. We're going to bid farewell to the grandfather's son, and we will bid farewell to them in thousands of ways. We don't care what the government will do. Gomez and others, however, clearly cared about what the government did. They were particularly upset about plans to capitalize on the event through spectacular shows organized in archaeological parks, with an especially large celebration in the key tourist center of Tikal. Well, as it turned out, according to frustrated hoteliers and tour operators, the Guatemalan government actually did very little to promote things. A press release from the National Tourist Board 4 months before the fated date mentioned that celebrations would take place in Tikal, in the capital city, and they coyly hinted that invitations to attend had been extended to, among others, Neil Young, Bruce Springsteen, U2, Elton John, Placido Domingo, and the surviving Jackson brothers. Now, well, it seems that these luminaries were otherwise occupied. The main show in Tikal did feature a high-tech, laser and holograph-laden song and dance rendering of classic Maya life that was produced and televised by the international media conglomerate Zodiac. And it was designed and performed by the French company Les Petits Français. Following the big event, when the sun, doubtless pleased with all the attention, rose on the 22nd of December, and upwards of 7,000 tourists released their breath and made their way out of the Payten jungle, irreparable damage was reported to Temple 2, which has been off limits to clambering tourists for a number of years. There's me, I wasn't allowed to climb up there then. Now, I didn't manage to make it to Guatemala for this event, but I followed things closely online, including live streams of the alternative Maya-led commemoration of the event organized by Oxlahuac. These were basically vigils featuring speech and fire ceremonies that saw in the new cycle in about 22 locations. Most of them were archaeological sites, but there were also natural sites where shamans do their ceremonies. Now, talking to Felipe Gomez in 2014, he stressed to me how his organization had been courted by the state to become part of the official activities, which he characterized as a largely meaningless show. As government officials recognized the level of organization and contemporary Maya representation that his group has attracted. As he explained, during the celebration, there was as a quote here, there was tension between the government and Oxlahuac because we managed to constitute ourselves as the entity that demonstrated that it had a proposal, whether big or small, we had one. So each time I'd speak to the media, I'd note that with the government's celebration, including on the very day, the night of the 20th in Tikal, they didn't want the Maya priests to enter to do their ceremonies. The people called me and I said, fine, right here in the webpage, we're gonna work on this. And they started to report this on the webpage. And the government saw this and really quickly they said, puchicas, which is a Guatemalan way of saying, oh my God, they're denouncing us. Why are we doing this? But at the end of it all, I think that at the general level, the indigenous people weren't prepared for the celebration. It was everyone in their own place doing their own work. In some ways, the people who weren't Maya had more motivation about this, while for the majority of our people who work in the institution of the state, their involvement was limited to their institutions and didn't go any further. Now, Gomez points to a few important tensions here when it comes to organizing action based on ethnic and religious attachments. He was pleased to be able to do something authentically Maya, more authentically Maya for 2012 than the state seemed capable of. And he was glad that he, as a Maya, was recognized by the media, national and international, as an authority here. He was proud of the power of his organization to, through social media pressure, embarrass the government for refusing Maya priests to enter onto the site to celebrate their ceremonies, thereby violating their own legislation, which includes archaeological sites not simply as national patrimony, but sacred centers for practitioners of Maya spirituality, to which they must be granted largely unfettered access. But reflecting more generally, he lamented that the indigenous people in Guatemala, more broadly in Guatemala, didn't seem to be behind the event as fully as he had hoped. Indeed, they seemed less enthusiastic than many non-Maya. Read here, New Agers, if you like. Now, as I noted above, finding ways to be Maya, to perform your identity in religious terms is an important goal for many. But with the ambiguous status of, as with the ambiguous status of Shekol's Maya's church, it's a fraught affair. While archaeological sites are places where the interests of the state, which is expressed through tourism, compete with the interests of academic authorities to control these spaces, Maya activists have managed to find access here through claims to religious rights that are associated with their ethnic identity. But it's worth noting these archaeological sites have not typically been the sorts of places where shamans have performed their ceremonies in the past. More common are mountainside altars that dot the landscape, and which the state is also trying to document and protect. Well, one might assume that these spaces would be largely free from competition from other religious or ethnic others. It's not the case. As Pentecostal Christians, many of them indigenous, have come to use these natural spaces as places to perform their own rituals, which might involve spiritual warfare against the evil Maya deities which they imagined to haunt the sites. There's a couple pictures here of a ceremony on the top of a volcano. In the background, there's some charismatic Catholics doing their ceremony. And here's a group of charismatic Catholics from Shikul, also kind of in a natural site doing their work. Now, just to conclude here, as it turns out when dealing with ethnic categories, the question of who decides membership is rather complex in any context. The thing about ethnicity, at least according to received anthropological wisdom stemming from Frederick Barth, an influential thinker on these matters, is that this category of identity is defined more by the character of the boundary that's constructed mutually and fitfully with non-members of the group than by any particular trait like religion or language. As he observed, while the specific contents of an ethnic identity can change remarkably over time, a sense of difference, whatever that might be based on, persists. So in short, the way boundaries are drawn between Maya and non-Maya depends very much on who you're speaking to. It also depends on the place itself. Is it a community like Shekul, or is it the nation of Guatemala, or is it Tikal during 2012? To conclude, I encourage that when we consider the various ways we define others, ethnic, racial, religious, class-based, national, whatever, and think about the possibility that what we think we know about them might be more about boundary making, which helps build our own sense of self as much as anything. What are these others allowed to be in order to remain authentic in our imagining? What freedom, including the freedom to just be complex and untidy, do we allow them here? Is it the same freedom we tend to demand for ourselves to assert our own unique, though actually pretty similar identities? If not, what does that say about us? Thank you very much.